Welcome to the 2015 Ida B and Beyond Conference, presented by the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee. Held in conjunction with the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications 40th Annual Southeast Colloquium. This conference is a component of the Ida B. Wells Initiative, an interdisciplinary project to foster student and scholarly research on Ida B. Wells and other social justice crusaders. The 2015 Ida B and Beyond Conference is brought to you by UT's Ready for the World program, the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, the Commission for Blacks, the College of Communication and Information at the University of Tennessee, the School of Journalism and Electronic Media, the Department of History, and other private donations.
Good evening. Welcome to the inaugural Ida B and Beyond Conference. We are so pleased to have you here on the University of Tennessee's campus. And it is my pleasure in a brief moment to introduce you to preeminent Ida B. Wells-Barnett scholar and our keynote speaker, Mia Bay. Before I do so, however, I want to say a few words about our ongoing Ida initiative, which is an interdisciplinary project to foster research about the life, the work, and the legacy of Ida B. Wells-Barnett and other like-minded social justice crusaders. Over the last 2 years, we have hosted several panels at national conferences, and in the aftermath of this inaugural conference hosted at UT, we have plans to continue the initiative by hosting future conferences here, as well as by publishing an edited volume of scholarship, by producing a student documentary on Wells-Barnett, and by partnering with museums across the Southeast to curate exhibits about Wells-Barnett in the interest of public history. Of course, an initiative such as this would not be possible without the interest of a wide range of scholars and generous support from a wide range of sponsors and private contributors. Tonight I wish to thank a few. Most notably the participants of today's Ida B and Beyond Conference, who include a very wide range of scholars. From a group of Sevier County Middle School students who will compete in the state of Tennessee's National History Day competition in several weeks, as well as UT graduate and undergraduate students, and a host of scholars from across the nation, many of whom are here in this room tonight, such as Mia Bay, Jinx Broussard, and James Morris McGrath. I would also, of course, be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors, including the University of Tennessee's Ready for the World program, the Office of Diversity, the Commission for Blacks, the College of Communication and Information, the School of Journalism and Electronic Media, the Department of History, and the East Tennessee chapter of the Society of Professional Journalism, or journalists, rather. Finally, before I get to the introduction, in lieu of purchasing a ticket tonight, many of these kinds of events you have to hand over 10 or 12 or whatever, I would like to encourage you to do one of the following. That would be to donate money either to the Ida Initiative or another project that's very near and dear to our initiative's heart. And that's the Ida B Monument, which you can learn more about through idabwellsmonument.org or through the information packet that you may have picked up outside. If not, it's still there. You can pick it up on your way out. And now, of course, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Mia Bay. She's the director for the Center of Race and Ethnicity at Rutgers University. And she, of course, is a preeminent scholar on race, gender, and ethnicity in the United States. As such, she's published 2 books about Wells-Barnett. Her intellectual biography of Wells, To Tell the Truth Freely, which was published in 2009, earned critical acclaim. As one reviewer noted, one of the most novel aspects of Bay's biography was her depiction of Wells as the living link between the abolitionist tradition and the 20th century civil rights movement. Bay's second work on Wells, The Light of the Truth, Writings of an Anti-Lynching Crusader, was published in 2014, and it's a co-edited collection of essays with Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Bay, who received her PhD from Yale University in 1993, is currently completing several other manuscripts. One is entitled The Ambidexter Philosopher, Thomas Jefferson and Free Black Thought. She's also researching the social history of segregated transportation. And now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure, truly, if you knew what the past few days were like for me, it's my great pleasure to turn over the podium to Mia Bay.
Well, thank you all for coming out on this chilly night in this chilly room. Hope everyone will keep warm. The talk I want to give you today is drawn on my three most recent books that you see before you. Of course, the biography, as well as a new Penguin collection, The Light of Truth, which is actually not co-edited. Henry Louis Gates just puts his name on everything. But she's the series editor, which is actually a complete collection of Wells's available journalism, and that's the first time we actually have had a complete collection together. So it's a very useful book. And the third book is coming out, I think, next month, and it's a collaboration between a whole bunch of scholars who were interested in thinking about the intellectual history of black women. And one of the reasons I was interested in Wells from the beginning was because I wanted to think about black women as intellectuals. Black women are more often seen as support workers, activists, but sort of their ideas and where they get them from, especially in the case of Wells, who didn't have any formal education, it's something that I'm interested in thinking about as a historian. I realize journalists have a different way of thinking about things, so I think, in terms of what I've learned this morning, I think that part of what I was interested in, to put it more in the terms here, was sort of what kind of subjectivity shaped the questions she asked, because she asked unusual questions and came up with truly original answers, and just how she got through that process and what inspired her is something I want to explore a little today. So without further ado, let me start. In the late 19th century, Wells was unquestionably the most famous black woman in the world. A leading journalist, speaker, and civil rights activist, Wells achieved international renown in the 1980s when she was barely 30 years old, and you can see her here in one of these sort of prominent African-American books of that period, and she's sort of almost a startling figure with these male figures. She's really even more startling when you think of that she was at that time considered by many to be the logical heir to Frederick Douglass, who's in the middle, who the fugitive slave, who became Black America's great leader after emancipation. Her contemporaries considered her activist character, brilliant intellect, and leadership skills to be unusual in a woman, and often discussed her as a woman who had all the talents of a man. She wrote under the pen name Iola, and one of her contemporaries said, "If Iola were a man, she would be a humming independent in politics. She had plenty of nerve and is as sharp as a steel trap." Born to slave parents just as slavery was ending, Wells actually did grow up as a woman who frequently assumed masculine roles. At 16, she took charge of raising her 6 younger siblings after her parents died in the yellow fever epidemic that swept the Mississippi Valley in 1878, and she became a teacher and took the job as the breadwinner of her household. Then she also survived that experience to go on to become a journalist and editor. Yet, for all she takes this male career path, unparalleled by any woman of her day, I would argue that her thought and her personal experiences are very much shaped by her gender. She became most famous for her lifelong crusade against lynching, which was fueled by an incisive analysis of the politics of white supremacy that was really unanticipated in the work of male thinkers of her day, both black and white. That analysis, I'm going to argue, really grew out of her experiences as a black woman, in which she was continually challenged to question the conventional understandings of gender and sexual relations by virtue of the fact that Southern notions of chivalry rarely applied to black women. So her activism takes place around these experiences, and they provoke her to question the relationship between race, gender, and political power, and question Southern stories about subjects such as lynching. I'm going to sort of make these points by briefly outlining some of her early experiences that were particularly formative. The perils of being a woman in the post-emancipation South caught up with Wells when she was very young. She was just 16 when her parents died, and possibly felt younger. In her autobiography, she remembers herself as only 14, a slip that probably reflected how overwhelming it was to face becoming the head of her household at that age. Some of her parents' friends thought that children should be split up, but Wells did not think that her parents would have liked that, and insisted on taking care of her siblings. She dropped out of school to become a teacher, teaching grade school. And as a young, inexperienced girl who had never even had a beau, she was all of a sudden living alone with her brothers and sisters, heading the household. One of the great shocks of this early period was that she found that in taking care of her parents, taking care of her late father's business, she went to see a doctor who had been keeping some money in safekeeping for him, and immediately rumors began to spread around Holly Springs, Mississippi, where they lived, was that Ida had been seen asking white men for money, and the reason she wanted to live by herself with the children was that she planned to be a prostitute. This misconstruction was one of the greatest shocks of her life, and it introduced her, was a really abrupt introduction into the racially and sexually charged public sphere of the postbellum South. Because what Ida was up against when she was seen talking to this white man was not just the conservative sexual mores of the late 19th century. Instead, it was Ida's race rather than breach of these sexual mores that made her so vulnerable to allegations of sexual impropriety. Both black men and women were traditionally seen as especially lascivious and morally loose in American thought, especially in the South. And these kind of ideas about black people grew worse rather than better after Reconstruction. During slavery, they reflected the slaves' lack of power to contract legitimate liaisons or exercise complete control over their sexuality. And during the 1880s and 1890s, when white redeemers were working to reclaim political power in the South, attacks on black power, black political power, black voting, black civil rights often took the form of attacks on black men as rapists who lusted after white women, and it also took the form of campaigns that denigrated black women as well. The Redeemers, in short, built their campaigns around protecting the virtue of white women, and in doing so, they underscored that black women did not require similar protection. In reality, as Ida would frequently emphasize, black women were often exploited and victimized by white men, and what she learned at 16 was that black women were always easily suspected of impropriety, so much so that they had to be hyper-vigilant to protect their reputations. In the short run, Ida dealt with this problem by reaching out to an older female relative to share the household and serve as her chaperone, but unlocking the politics behind the rumors would be the next step. It would come in the form of another lesson learned through hard experience. Ida became a political journalist as a result of another utterly confounding clash with the race and gender politics of her region. Her road to journalism began with nothing more complicated than a trip to work. By the early 1880s, she was living in Memphis, which you see pictured here, but she was still teaching in rural Tennessee. She didn't have the qualifications to get a school in one of Memphis's, to get a job in one of Memphis's schools, so she continued to commute. She had always taught in these country schools that only went up a few grades because she really didn't have a lot of training. During the 1880s, the South was changing, and what was changing included transportation. And during her first jobs, Wells had commuted to work by mule. And in Memphis, she was able to travel to work by what was then a new modern convenience in passenger travel, the railroad. But the railroad, as it turned out, would have more complications than the mule. In 1880, Jim Crow segregation was still taking shape in the South, and railroad cars were not yet formally segregated by race, but taking a seat on a train had become a truly complex proposition for middle-class black women. Trains during that period typically consisted of a locomotive and 2 passenger cars, the first of which was something called the smoking car, which accommodated men who smoked, which most men did during that time period. And then the last car, the furthest from the engine, was the ladies' car. Smoking was not allowed in the ladies' car. The ladies' car also didn't smoke in another way because the locomotives tended to cast sparks into the first car. So one of the reasons why women didn't like to sit in the smoking car was your dress could actually light on fire. So these ladies' cars, which the railroad essentially instituted to persuade women to ride the railroad, were the third car on the train. They had more comfortable seats. They typically had bathrooms for both sexes, and they were supposed to be reserved for ladies and the men and children who were traveling with ladies. So Wells, when she commuted by train, took the ladies' car, but one day when she sat down in the ladies' car as usual, she had her ticket refused by the conductor, who told her that he couldn't possibly take it. He said to her that he would treat me like a lady, but I must go into another car, which made Wells say, if he wished to treat me like a lady, he should leave me alone and remain where she was. The conductor finished collecting tickets, and then he returned, moving Wells's belongings into the other car, and then attempted to dislodge her. She kept insisting that the forward car was a smoker, and she did not intend to move. He finally lost all patience with her, grabbed her arm, and tried to drag her out of the seat. Wells was utterly determined not to move, so she grabbed the seat and bit him on the hand. At 21, Wells had grown up to be a petite woman. She was less than 5 feet tall. But nonetheless, the conductor did go and get 2 other men, and the 3 of them picked her up and carried her bodily out the car. Wells would later recollect that as the 3 men carried her out, the white passengers even stood in their seats so they could get a good view and applauded the conductor for his brave stand. Wells's altercation on the train dramatized the day-to-day indignities that black women could expect to find on the railroads during that time period. Writing in 1892, another black Southerner, Annie Julia Cooper, reflected that black women who tried to defend their claims to womanhood in these kind of public situations were caught in a double bind. They were extended few courtesies by white train officials, even when allowed to travel. They often received no assistance getting off the train or with their luggage. The railroad conductors would sort of turn away when black women came to alight. Yet at the same time, they had to face the fact that any protest would make them look even less ladylike to scornful white audiences who never saw a middle-class white woman fight to be treated courteously. The feeling of slighted womanhood, Cooper reflected, is unlike any other emotion in the soul. Its first impulse is wrathful protest and self-vindication, which is then checked and shamed by the consciousness that self-assertion will lead to further attack. Now, such emotions may have torn at Wells, but they did not curb her impulse towards self-assertion. throughout her life, she would rarely back down in a fight. She got off the train rather than ever accepting a seat in the smoker, returned to Memphis by wagon, and promptly filed suit. Shortly afterwards, she would have another altercation on the train and file a second suit, even before her first was settled. And in May, that year, in May 1884, she also began to write about her suits, writing her first articles ever, publishing them in a local Baptist newspaper called The Living Way. Now, Wells would lose both of her suits, but not after, but it would take a while, and during that period, she would really begin to be a journalist. In filing the suits, she joined a long line of African-American men and women who fought for a place on common carriers in 19th century America. In fact, one of the reasons the laws come along to segregate these carriers is because in the aftermath of slavery, when you begin to have free blacks and you begin to have blacks who can afford seats in the ladies' car, African Americans pressed to have these seats. And their status in doing so is complicated, especially for women, because the distinction between ladies' cars and other seating arrangements is by the 19th century a traditional distinction in American law. Better seats, better cabins are often set aside for women. So when black women begin to insist on sitting in them, they actually have the common law on their side. They can claim access to the ladies' car by virtue of a long tradition that sets aside special facilities for women. But as she would find out by the 1880s, black women's challenges to railroad segregation, among other things, had helped to push southern states towards Jim Crow laws that separated railroad passengers by race. Tennessee was actually a pioneer in this area. It had passed a new law in 1881 requiring railroads to provide separate but equal accommodations for black railroad passengers. This law was not, in fact, intended to improve matters for African Americans. It was meant to block African American challenges to racial discrimination by providing more systematic sanction for separating the races. It didn't apply on Wells's train, which actually did not have any separate but equal facilities. But in the end, it would nonetheless work against her prevailing in court. In the lower court, she did actually win. The judge who ruled on her case, who was an ex-Union soldier from Minnesota, said that she was a person of ladylike appearance and deportment, a school teacher, and one who might be expected to object to traveling in the company of rough or boisterous men, smokers, or drunkards. As such, he concluded that she was entitled to ride in the car and awarded her $500 in damages. But that was the last affirmation of her qualities as a lady that Wells would receive in her court battle. When the news of the verdict came out, the Memphis Commercial Appeal scoffed, "Darky damsel gets damages," and expressed outrage over what it cost to put a colored teacher in a smoking car. Moreover, the case went on and up to the higher court, where the Tennessee State Supreme Court ultimately concurred with the railroad, declaring that the two cars were alike in every respect. There was a long and quite funny discussion about whether you could smoke in the smoking car, and the railroad insisted that people didn't usually smoke in the smoking car. It was called the smoking car for some other reason. But she lost, which was a terrible hardship to her in several ways. She had to pay damages, which were a lot on her limited salary, especially given the fact that she was still supporting some of her brothers and sisters. And she also felt that the decision had terrible import for African Americans generally. I think someone read this quote this morning. She had believed that the law was on her side, and if we appealed to it, it would give us justice. But then she wondered, is there no redress, no peace, no justice in this land for us? Wells' anguish was even more justified than she knew. By the 1890s, it would become clear that her case was one of the many state-level steps on the road to Plessy versus Ferguson, the famous 1896 court case, that ruled that blacks could be relegated to all kinds of different separate but equal accommodations. But in the case of Wells, for all her anguish, the experience did shape her as a writer and begin her career as an activist. She was only 21 when she first launched her case, but she was already discontented with teaching. She was all too aware that she was not very educated herself. She had really not quite completed high school because of the death of her parents, and she never qualified to teach beyond the elementary level. And she didn't enjoy teaching, perhaps because she was so young when she started teaching. Wells felt overwhelmed by the educational needs of her country-bred students and their ex-slave parents. They lacked not only book learning, she reflected, but guidance in everyday life, which she felt ill-equipped to provide. With a little more age and experience, Wells would begin to feel she could provide this guidance, but she would feel that she was best suited to doing so as a writer rather than a teacher. In writing for newspapers, Wells was able to put her self-education to use, drawing on her voracious reading and personal experience to become an interpreter of Southern life. She called herself Iola, choosing a name with a rural twang to underscore that she was a country girl. And here's a picture of Iola. And as Iola, she built on the aspirations that she had first formed as a teacher, writing in a plain, common-sense way about the things that concerned our people. Her articles reflected that Wells felt that African Americans' concerns were not limited to the women's issues typically discussed by female journalists. She did publish in the women's columns, but she also wrote about racial discrimination and politics, as well as more ladylike subjects, and her articles on these subjects reflected her awareness that these were issues that were important to both men and women. That was one of the lessons of her railroad case, is that these things would affect everyone. So here's an article by Iola on discrimination. As Iola, and I'm just going to flip back to that picture, Wells was a tremendous success. She actually, her moniker, the Princess of the Press, is actually given to her by male black journalists. She goes to the press associations, and she's both very successful and kind of celebrated as a young, attractive woman. So she's becomes very well known within the journalism establishment during that time period. She also becomes successful enough to leave teaching behind entirely. She buys up part ownership in the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight in 1889, and begins to live entirely off her business. During this period, Wells is really quite thrilled with herself. She's launched most of her brothers and sisters. Her business is doing well. But as it turns out, her new business won't last long. In 1892, the free speech was destroyed in the aftermath of a brutal triple lynching that rocked Black Memphis. Like Wells' conflict in the ladies' car, the dispute seemed to erupt over absolutely nothing. White and black boys squabbled over a game of marbles in a black neighborhood known as the Curb. Later in the evening, their parents joined in after one of the fathers of one of the white boys personally whipped a victorious black player. And then, outraged by the whipping, several black men went and confronted this father at his home, which was next door to the People's Grocery Store, an African-American-owned joint stock grocery store. And when they went in, the people in the People's Grocery Store fought back. There was a gunfight, which left several white men wounded. And what happened after that was essentially a race riot in which whites in Memphis terrorized the black inhabitants of the Curb for several days, dragging more than 30 black men off to jail, and ultimately taking 3 of them out at night one night and shooting them. The 3 men who were shot were people who were well known to Wells, Thomas Moss, who was also a postmaster as well as an investor in the People's Grocery Store, a mailman, Calvin McDowell, another proprietor, and Will Stewart, who worked in the store. And what was striking, she would find, was that they were all more or less blameless in the disputes. Thomas Moss was not even in the store at the time of the altercation. None of them had fired shots. And ultimately, it became clear that they were targeted largely because of the store itself. The man who led the mob was a man who owned the white grocery store across the street, which had been losing business to the People's Grocery Store. Now, Wells had been out of town selling newspapers when the lynching occurred, and she returned home to find her world utterly transformed. Her dear friend Tommy Moss was dead. Blacks were fleeing Memphis, and she had this kind of crazy, incoherent story about why this all had happened to deal with. Newspapers like the Memphis Commercial published long articles about it, including pictures, including gory pictures of the dead man, but all while kind of reaffirming that lynching was a necessary custom and almost even implying that there was actually some sort of cause for this that had something to do with rape. And Wells was shocked. She had been hearing lynching stories at a distance for some years in the South, but she had never sort of been up close and personal to anything. And she recalled that she even once thought that lynching was irregular, although irregular and contrary to public order, might be defensible. Unreasoning anger over the crime of rape led to lynching. Perhaps the brute deserved death anyhow, and the mob was justified in taking his life. But events in Memphis, as well as the news coverage about them, opened her eyes to what lynching really was. The Memphis victims were not accused of rape or any other crime. Instead, their deaths made Wells suspect that lynching might be little more than an excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized and, as she put it, the nigger down. Wells's suspicions built, I think, on her experiences with rumor and character defamation in the late 19th century South. She had been unfairly accused of being a prostitute and a troublemaker herself. So she knew that character defamation often served to police social boundaries and support racial hierarchies. Moreover, her suspicions were confirmed when she began to research lynchings. She looked into every lynching that she read about, using her press pass to kind of actually visit places and kind of get the scuttlebutt on what was happening. And she found that not only a third were ever even accused of rape, which meant 2/3 were not, and that those who were accused of rape were usually accused on the flimsiest, most dubious of evidence. Her discoveries about lynching enraged her, and she began to run a series of anti-lynching editorials in Free Speech. Writing at a time when the crime of rape as committed by Negroes was supposedly on the rise in the South, Harper's Bazaar labeled it the new Negro crime, Wells took on that allegation. She took on the charge that white Southerners most often invoked as the unassailable justification for the practice of lynching. She published all her information about lynchings occurring in the absence of accusations of rape, and also contended that most of the black men who were lynched for raping white women were guilty of no other crime than having a consensual sexual relationship with a white woman. She also revealed some of her research, talking about the clandestine interracial relationships that often lay behind lynchings. Wells was not the first African American to doubt the allegations of rape that lay behind that accompanied so many lynchings, but she was one of the very first to voice her doubts publicly and in no uncertain terms. In a May 21st editorial in Free Speech, she wrote, "Nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negroes rape white women. If Southern men are not careful, they will overreach themselves, and public sentiment will have a reaction. A conclusion will be reached that will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women." So in effect, she's really saying that Southern women are kind of easy, and this does not go over well. Again, she's away when the violence happened. She was traveling, promoting her newspaper when the editorial came out, which turned out to be very fortunate. With its publication, a white mob descended on free speech, shutting it down permanently. They broke the printing press, destroyed the papers. Wells was not actually identified as the writer of the editorial, so the white mob wasn't quite sure who to go after, but the Memphis newspapers did threaten whoever published it with death and dismemberment, which didn't change once her authorship was revealed. They had planned to castrate the male editor, and when Wells was revealed as the author, they said they would bleed her face and hang her in front of the courthouse. Obviously, Wells could not return to Memphis. She actually never came back. Instead, she devoted herself to exposing the truth about lynching. She moved north first to New York, began to write about lynching, began to speak about lynching. She would ultimately traverse the North and go to Britain, describing the events that led to her exile. In doing so, Wells would testify about lynching both as a woman. She would testify about lynching as a woman, and she would expand the boundaries of feminine discourse. Her accounts of events in Memphis would include heart-wrenching details, such as a description of the loss suffered by the baby daughter of Thomas Moss, who we see here in this picture of Wells with her good friend Betty Moss and Betty's 2 children. Wells wrote of the baby daughter that she was too young to express how she misses her father, so she would instead toddle to his wardrobe, seize the legs of his letter carrier uniform, and hug and kiss them with evident delight, while stretching her little hands to be taken up into arms that will never more clasp his daughter's form. But Wells didn't confine herself to this kind of heart-wrenching personal testimony. Instead, she expanded on the accusations in her editorial, exposing the rape myth that white Southerners used to justify lynching by challenging the connection between lynching and rape. She kept on naming specific white women in specific cases, documenting the nature of the interracial liaisons for which black men had been lynched, and concluded that white men lynch the offending African American not because he is a despoiler of women, but because he succumbs to the smiles of white women. She also reiterated her evidence that many lynchings, in the case of many lynchings, rape was not even invoked as a justification, and underscored that Southern whites victimized black women as well by imposing no punishment whatsoever on white men who assaulted black women. Wells's lectures on these subjects were all the more powerful because they violated 19th century taboos about the public discussion of sex, especially by women. Moreover, they also made it clear, as I think came up this morning, that lynching could not be addressed without a frank discussion of sexuality and rape and all the issues behind it. Otherwise, the connections that white Southerners made between rape and lynching would continue to stamp blacks as a race of rapists and desperados, and lynching would continue unopposed. Such was the power of the cry of rape. Humanity abhors the assailant womanhood, Wells declared, and this charge upon the Negro has placed him beyond the pale of human sympathy. By exposing the rape myth used to justify lynching, Wells recast lynching as a lesson in subordination that had little to do with sex or sexual assaults, a terrifying and extra-legal form of racial subjugation. It supplemented disenfranchisement, legal disabilities, and the economic exploitation that white Southerners used to enforce their often repeated slogan, "This is a white man's country and white men must rule." Wells's incisive analysis of lynching turned her anti-lynching crusade into an all-out assault on the color line. For 2 years after leaving Memphis, she traveled America and Britain speaking out against lynching before packed houses. During these years, she also published her anti-lynching lectures in 2 pamphlets Southern Horrors, which you see here, and a Red Record, as well as publishing numerous articles on lynching. In addition to demystifying the rape myth, her lectures and writings from this period contain a stinging critique of conditions in the South, which tied lynching and disenfranchisement together with other injustices that she had experienced personally, creating a seamless assault on white supremacy. Wells presented herself as a witness to the collapse of Reconstruction and testified on the Southern conditions that had shaped her life. She deplored the repeal of the Reconstruction-era Civil Rights Act that had made it impossible for her to achieve justice in the courts, and condemned the disenfranchisement laws that made it impossible for black men to protect themselves or their families against white violence. Lynching, she emphasized, was a product of the social and legal disabilities that white Southerners had imposed on blacks, and it would not be eradicated until black Southerners regained their rights. Still strikingly incisive today, Wells's analysis of lynching and white supremacy made her a celebrity and defined anti-lynching as a cause. By decoupling lynching from rape and addressing white supremacy as the root cause of lynching, she made lynching into a crime that could be opposed, rather than a practice that required no defense among whites and inspired shame and terror among blacks. Lynching continued both during and after Wells's campaign. There was a horrific lynching in Paris, Texas in 1893, not long, during the early years of Wells's campaign. But it was never as unopposed as it had been before. In just 2 years of agitation, Wells was able to mobilize organized opposition to lynching among both blacks and whites in America and abroad. Anti-lynching would become one of the central platforms of the new civil rights organizations formed around the turn of the century, and the fact-finding techniques that Wells pioneered to expose the truth about lynching would continue. Organizations such as the NAACP and the Urban League would follow the lead established in Wells's anti-lynching pamphlets of the 1890s, which in fact investigated the facts behind lynching cases and compiled detailed statistics on the incidence of lynching. So, much like the abolitionists who she admired and sought to emulate, Wells did manage to change the way a small but significant number of people thought about something. Anti-lynching, like anti-slavery, really starts out with ideas as an intellectual movement. So thinking about it does shed light on Wells's intellectual contribution to American life and the character of her activism. Her activism, I believe, was shaped by the almost intolerable contradictions of being both black and female, rather than any kind of engagement with the leading thinkers of her day. Her thought gained its insights from an anguished and personal rethinking of the relationship between race, gender, and political power. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia. Now we have some time for questions from the audience. So just call out. Yes, Jamie.
I was struck by the centrality of her suing the railroad as sort of the key moment that makes her into who she's going to become. And you describe her as unschooled, not uneducated, but having gotten out of school. What prompts her to seek a legal solution? I mean,
that is a good question.
And I don't mean to be stereotypical, but a black female in Memphis going to a court which would involve money and legal rationale. What prompts her to sue them?
She is aware of the Civil Rights Law of 1875, which has not yet been overturned when she starts her cases, so that may be part of it. And I suspect what schooling that her parents were also quite political. Her father was a member of the Republican Party and would go to political meetings at night. The college that she went to, Rust College, was run by people of abolitionist sentiments. I think she had been sort of brought up in this sort of fight for your rights tradition. And then she also just had this kind of indomitable will that actually is kind of hard to explain. You know, I mean, she just, she never had any money, and why she thought she could take on this court case is unclear, but she just did it.
Did she know she had common law on her side?
I think she probably did. I mean, because it was. She seemed to be sort of aware of these things, and she wrote about things. She wrote about the Jim Crow car, so she was, she apparently, at least by the time she moved to Chicago, she sort of began her morning by reading like 4 different newspapers, which I suspect is something she began quite young. So she knew a lot.
Other questions from the audience? Yes. Your name? Would you say your name?
Selena. What is your opinion on what her split off with the leadership of the NAACP did for her career following?
Well, I think it did help lead to her being forgotten and not remembered. It was almost inevitable at the time, though. I mean, the early NAACP was very much a biracial organization with a very limited room for black leadership. So there was only a few slots for blacks on the initial leadership. It also was organized at a time when increasingly people with professional degrees such as Du Bois, were really seen as the most appropriate people to exercise any kind of leadership. So, and in some ways, her militance also made it almost sure that she wasn't going to get much of a position, because in the early days of the NAACP, even Du Bois, who tended to be somewhat arrogant himself, was dealing very carefully with the white leaders who were providing most of the funding for it. And Wells had this reputation, pretty much deserved, as a bull in a china shop. She was not going to have a prominent position, and she really never did well in most organizations. She was too radical and too direct.
Other questions?
Well, this, maybe you just answered it because you said that she didn't do well in organization, but I know that during some of that period of time there were some anti-lynching societies.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talked about her, you talked about her, I think, more in terms of like being an individual campaigner. But was she ever connected with any of the...
Yeah, I mean, she inspired all of the first anti-lynching societies. She inspired a wave of black women's clubs that took on lynching as a cause starting in 1893, and then her trips to Britain inspired the formation of a British anti-lynching society that researched lynchings and wrote letters to Southern newspapers. So she inspired a lot of organizations and was members of them. Was a member of many of them, but often not for a long time. The exception would be the Negro Fellowship League, a small organization that she founded and led with Joe Trotter in Chicago, Monroe Trotter, excuse me. So yes, she was involved in anti-lynching, and she really did sort of pioneer the idea that of all the many problems that the black community faced during this period, you really had to start with lynching. You had to start with trying to eradicate lynching, protecting life and limb, and also really thinking about the ways in which lynching sort of represented all of the other problems. Yes?
I'm also in the field of history, and I know that we don't like to do this too much, deal with the present, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm always kind of interested in the connections between the past and the present. And since I think it's pretty clear that we need an anti-lynching campaign now. So I'm wondering if you think, specific things occur to you that we might be taking out of her campaign and her experience that might serve us in some way now.
Well, I think she foresaw some of this, because when she moves to Chicago, she sees that while there's less things like lynching, and she's actually able to help eradicate lynching in Illinois, she sees that the justice system is very hard on the young black male migrants who are beginning to come to Chicago, and that they're going to prison in disproportionate numbers, and that there's sort of a kind of racism that is not extra legal like lynching, but it's legal. And she actually becomes an early parole officer. She also, her Negro Fellowship League works to try to keep some of these young black men out of jail. So I think she's very much aware of this, and I'm not sure what she would propose at this point, I think it would probably be a complete overhaul of the police system, and which seems to be part of what's necessary here, as well as greater attention to the kinds of things that are happening. I mean, one of the things that's so striking about Ferguson and so forth is how long this stuff is going on and how rarely it sort of becomes a big deal. So that would be something that she would be just enraged by.
I have a question too, if I'm allowed. Do you think she shifted her strategy to a local one as a result of kind of losing her influence at a national level, or because she felt that she could affect more change at a local level?
I think it was at least in part because she had children. I mean, that was part of it. I mean, she initially had planned to actually sort of give up her career after she had children. She had some notion that, you had to be with your children for at least the first 5 years of her life, which she gave up within 6 months. But it did make her harder for her to travel as much as she had. And that ban from going to the South was pretty much lifelong. I mean, they would renew that threat every couple of years. So she couldn't go as many places as she used to. So I think it was, I think there were a variety of practical reasons. You may be right, she felt like she could do more. Ferdinand Barnett, the man she married, was very well connected in Illinois, and she really saw very concrete ways she could have influence in Illinois politics and Illinois legal system. So perhaps that was also part of it.
I think we do have time for at least one more question. Is there a final question in the room?
We met before. I used
Yes.
to work for the commercial field, of course not back in those days. But I was wondering the idea of the gender. What do you think the reaction would have been to a man doing crusading against lynching in the same manner through journalism? I mean, did that enable her to survive, or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a way in which it was sort of essential that black women take up this cause. It was very hard for black men to kind of defend themselves from the charge of lynching without sounding defensive, like I do not beat my wife, for a black man to talk about white women and to have that kind of discussion that Wells was having would have been really impossible. I even think it helped that Wells was such a petite, pretty little woman. She could kind of get up there, she'd have like a tear running down her cheek, she'd tell her story, and even so, it was still shocking, and some people found it offensive. But she could get away with it more easily than the black men could. And I think she also saw it from a different perspective. She had a sort of wider perspective on what was going on than a lot of black men during that period.
Well, let's have a huge round of applause.
Welcome to the 2015 Ida B. and Beyond Conference, presented by the School of Journalism and Electronic Media at the University of Tennessee. Held in conjunction with the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications 40th Annual Southeast Colloquium. This conference is a component of the Ida B. Wells Initiative, an interdisciplinary project to foster student and scholarly research on Ida B. Wells and other social justice crusaders. The 2015 Ida B. and Beyond Conference is brought to you by UT's Ready for the World program, the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, the Commission for Blacks, the College of Communication and Information at the University of Tennessee, the School of Journalism and Electronic Media, the Department of History, and other private donations.